love babies. Babies are adorable little eating, sleeping, pooping machines that fill our lives with joy, happiness, and lots of diapers. Hi, this is Grandma Says, and I'm here to tell you how you can have a wonderful, happy life, enjoying the raising of your children while using old school methods that have for some reason been discarded by a lot of people, or people who just didn't know about it. So I'm here to tell you about it. Do you remember that once upon a time, moms could stay home and sew cute bonnets and bed sheets, and dads picked up their sons and carried them on their shoulders to the ice cream parlor? And when kids started school, parents were in the driveway taking pictures, and a strong family unit became the support mechanism that led to a healthy, stable adult who copied that same process when they had kids. Yeah, well, things aren't like that anymore. There are people who are arguing whether you should ask your baby for permission to change their diapers. They want to negotiate bedtimes and let their children dictate what the family gets to watch on TV. Some kids are sent home from school for getting in trouble as early as kindergarten. Now, can we really say that that's how most families want to live? Probably not. Many methods from a past era have been discarded in favor of things that aren't working quite the way that we planned. These short snippets that I'll provide for you will help you to find the balance that will make parenting easier, more fun, rewarding, engaging, and best of all, lead to better relationships with your children. Sometimes all it takes is a word or two from grandma to get the kids back in line and the parents back in control of their homes and offspring. Parenting does not have to be hard. In fact, it should be a lot of fun. This grandma, the one you're talking to, has over 30 years of experience in nonprofit, private, and public sectors of child-related programs and organizations that service all ages from birth to college graduates. My experiences with children rolled over into how I chose to raise my sons, and now I'm a very happy grandma. I would love to share these insights with you so you too can have a happy home life that will lead to a lot less stress and a lot more fun. Now, we know that for everything we do, there's a reason. So you might be thinking, okay, so what's her reason for telling us this? Well, here's my reason for giving away all this information that would normally cost thousands of dollars. And no, I am not exaggerating. Have you seen the cost of curriculums for private schools, medical advice, school psychiatrists? Yeah, this podcast will save you tons of money. So, what do I want you to do with all the money that you save? Well, this podcast, in a nutshell, is a fundraiser. Yes, COVID has caused a lot of young adults to fall behind in this never-ending cycle of school, marriage, family, career. Many are finding themselves between residencies. In the past year or so, I've had so many kids on my couch, I decided it would make more sense to try and help them to get a solid foundation where they can land versus them continuing this never-ending cycle of on again, off again, week after week, couch surfing and ride catching. And this past year and a half has been a just, oh my gosh, kids showing up who need childcare, pet care. Some of them have cars they can't drive, appointments they can't get to, medical advice because they don't have insurance. Let me reiterate, I'm a grandma. I'm too old for this shit. So this fundraiser is to raise enough to purchase a large house or building where these young adults can stay when they're between houses, to purchase a few vans or vehicles that can provide transportation when our bus lines are down, since, they have been. So basically, it's a way to put the foundation back under their feet so they can work together to get through this mess. With a location they can share, no one will be homeless, and they'll all have space so they can build a garden if they need to, so they won't go without food. In essence, it's a central location they can use, and they can use that to take care of themselves, their families, and each other regardless of what may be coming their way next. This one location would provide a spot where they can crash for days or months, which means they won't be homeless and in the street. It'll provide an address because, believe it or not, without an address, you can't get a house, license, or job. In essence, I'm trying to build a place where they can work together to help each other out. Like some can watch each other's kids while others look for work. Once somebody gets a good paying job, they can put in a good word for each other, and then they can all work in the same place if they needed to. I suppose you could say my goal is to provide a path so that the generation that grew up with a lot of cuddling and hand holding, which is not their fault, by the way, uh, can learn from us that grew up in the sink or swim era. Those of us who learned to swim by being pushed into the deep end of the pool while you hear an adult yelling, "Hold your breath." Okay, I'm kidding. I'm teasing. That's not how I learned to swim. I'm exaggerating. But seriously, the young adults right now are in kind of a bad situation. Without knowing if they have a job from one day to the next, if the government's going to do what they say they'll do, when it's all said and done, we have to step in and show them how to survive. None of us can do this alone. So, this is a chance for them to get that foundation to learn to help each other. You remember back in the old days when we used to say, each one reach one and each one teach one? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing here. Because if things keep going the way they're going, we run the risk of losing a whole generation of kids lost in a system due to not having the proper foundation that they need to build right now. So I'm asking all of you, anyone who enjoys this podcast, and even if you don't, please consider donating to this cause. With your help, these young adults can continue the journey on the right path. So regardless of what comes their way, they will be able to stand on a stronger foundation and work through whatever's coming, whether we know about it or not. As you help me, I can help you, in which I can help you to tackle everything from breastfeeding to preparing for college using old school methods that work. I'll provide information to you from a generation ago, the generation that raised children to be loving, respectful, productive people. Those people you can be proud of when they become adults. Yeah, I think we know a few of them anyway. Okay, let me stop. So that was the introduction. And here are a few final words. No, I had not planned on doing anything like this. I had pretty much retired from dealing with other people's kids. This was totally not in my retirement plan. However, since I can't just watch this train wreck of a disaster and do nothing, I decided that my contribution was to attempt to make these podcasts to raise funds. Because although I'd love to throw millions of dollars into this project, wait, I did say I worked with kids, right? So yeah, I have the knowledge, but I'm going to need you guys to provide the funding. So basically, I'll be making these podcasts, and I have to give fair warning. I really am a grandma, and I'm old enough to say stuff that might not come out pretty or professional. So I give fair warning in advance. I cuss, I lose my train of thought, I may or may not finish a sentence, I'm subject to say or do whatever crosses my mind at that moment. And my excuse is, I'm old enough to say it like it is. But remember, it's the thought that counts. I do hope that you enjoy the information provided and that you'll find it useful and helpful in your parenting journey. Please understand that the people that you created and brought into this earth will more than likely be the people you'll be spending the rest of your current time on earth with. So to that end, do your absolute best to make sure that you're raising the people you'll enjoy being with and around for years and years and years to come. It all starts at day one, so where you go from there is entirely up to you. So as Grandma would say, and that's all I have to say about that. See you in the next podcast.